My role here is as a research associate at the Peter Harrison Center for Disability Sport. And I mean, we have several different research strands looking at, for example, the nutrition of athletes with spinal cord injuries and stuff like that. But I'm in the strand that is concerned with what we call the health and well-being of athletes, particularly from a psychosocial perspective. And that's the strand that this project's located in. And we're calling it Project PRISM. It's Paralympic Retirement, Insight, Support, and Management. And it's really a collaboration between the Peter Harrison Center and the EIS, and specifically the EIS's Performance Lifestyle team. And it was the Performance Lifestyle team and their advisors that came to us to propose this project, saying that they work daily with para-athletes, particularly in the area of transitions. So this is how athletes come into sport, but then also the transitions they make while in sport. So perhaps moving from a regional team to making that transition to being an international athlete. But the transition they're interested in at the moment is athletes who are leaving sport. This could be retirement, but generally leaving sport. And part of their mandate is to support these athletes in that transition. But the truth is, right now, once an athlete leaves sport, we don't really know what happens to them because they leave the sport system. So that was the idea behind Project PRISM, was to start exploring the experiences of para-athletes leaving sport, and then how can their experiences help us provide better services to athletes currently in sport.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think there hasn't been much done previously in this area of work? So I think with Olympians there's a fair idea. With Paralympians, why do you think it's something that's not been done?
There's a few reasons. I think one is that in many cases we're assuming that the experiences of Paralympians and Olympians are the same. Mm-hmm. And in many instances they are. I mean, athletes are athletes, and their retirement will have some common characteristics. But there are perhaps aspects of a Paralympian's experience that will be different. So to give you an example, in the research, they often distinguish between planned retirements and unplanned retirements. So a planned retirement is an athlete who leaves sport because they've achieved their sport goals, they're ready to pursue new opportunities. An unplanned retirement could be, for example, an injury, not being selected to the team. Now, those would apply to both Olympians and Paralympians. One that might be unique to Paralympians is their classification changes, or their event is dropped from the Paralympic Games. And that actually happens quite frequently. So that's an entirely new topic that you can't really just take the existing research and apply it. Another one that we're looking at is, for example, employment opportunities for Paralympians once they leave sport. So in the UK, the statistic is generally that 46% of disabled people of working age are not employed or underemployed. What we're interested in finding out is, does participation in sport actually perhaps improve a Paralympian's chance of being employed, or do they face the same barriers that disabled non-Paralympians, non-sports persons might face? Mm-hmm. And once again, that's something that we really can't tell from looking at the research that's been done on able-bodied athletes.
Mm-hmm. Do you predict any sort of outcomes will come of this? Do you have any idea of where this will go once you have the respondents in?
Outcomes, I mean, we're starting to see the replies come in. And as expected, I think, is that we're seeing athletes retire for many, many different reasons, and that they have many different experiences, that there is no single one sort of story that captures all their experiences. But in terms of outcomes, I think, yeah, we are starting to see some ways that the research could help current athletes, and that's particularly looking at the athletes who've had what they feel was a successful transition, and what are the characteristics of their story that we can. So for example, some of them already in the survey we're finding out they worked while they were in sport. So often athletes will say, you know, I don't have time to work, I have to be a full-time athlete. But we're actually finding out that perhaps part-time employment, casual employment during sport could actually be beneficial. Or part-time taking courses online, going to school part-time could actually be beneficial. So that's one finding that we can definitely take back immediately and start looking at opportunities for athletes to prepare for their retirement while still in sport. Other ones is looking at, for example, athletes who have felt they've had a successful transition. How did they approach potential employers? And was their profile as a Paralympian perhaps helpful to opening some doors? Or had the time they spent in sport, was that really seen as, well, it was time away from your education or away from the job market? And how did they convince employers that the skills they acquired in sport were actually transferable to a work setting?
I mean, can every retired British Paralympian get involved in this? Is that who you're looking for?
Yes, our goal is to reach as many retired Paralympians and internationally competitive para-athletes as possible. So this is anyone who represented GB at the Paralympic Games, a World Championship, a World Cup, a Nations Cup. Absolutely, we'd love to hear from them. Already in the sample of athletes who've participated, I'd say I know it's 1/3 of the sample is athletes who retired in the last 1 to 2 years. 1/3 is athletes who've retired since London, but 1/3 is athletes who retired prior to London, and that goes back to some of the athletes competed in 1972. So we are really trying to get as broad a sample as we possibly can.
And again, you'll be looking across both winter and summer, presumably?
Yes, yeah. I mean, given that the Winter Paralympics are a smaller event, the majority of athletes are from summer sports, but absolutely we're looking at all sports.
With regard to the results, when you get them in, what will be the next stage? What do you plan to do with the research, and how will you take it on to potentially help Paralympians in the future?
Well, maybe just a step back, there's actually 2 stages to the project. So the first stage is this survey where we're trying to reach as many Paralympians as possible. The second stage is interviews with some of the athletes who completed the surveys. So with the survey, we're trying to get a really broad look. By interviewing some of those respondents, we're trying to get more detail about the particular circumstances of their retirement. All of that is going to come back into a report that will be provided to the EIS, and that specifically will be provided to the EIS Performance Lifestyle team. Within the EIS, I'm working with a team of people there to help identify which of those findings are ones that the EIS can act on immediately, that they can start incorporating into their services right now. Some of those findings we're identifying as sort of long-term projects. So, for example, there's been talk of, can we bring retired Paralympians back to mentor current athletes? Can we start making connections with employers or potential employers, and for example, in some sort of job or career fair? But those are more long-term projects, but certainly things that we hope to have in place for when the athletes finish Rio and start looking for those next steps. The research will hopefully inform the services that will be provided to the Rio athletes.
And probably a final one from me, but I suppose it's quite pioneering in terms of what you're doing the first stage of it. How far do you think this can run? And once you've got this set up and got the research, but how far do you think it can go moving forward?
This is really the first research of its type. The only thing we have is one study maybe 20 years ago that said we should be looking at what happens to para-athletes and where they go and what they do after sport. But this is the first day, and I think it's really, EIS has shown that they want to be a leader in this area, that there's been a lot of focus in EIS, but also in the sport system generally, about how to get athletes into sport, particularly how to get disabled people into sport. So that pathway into sport, that's starting to, we understand that. We're starting to work on that. But it's the pathway out of sport that endless possibilities there. And I think one thing that I've been really impressed with working with the team at EIS is that they see this as part of their ethic of care. That if you're recruiting athletes into sport and you're supporting them in a sport career, you also have to support them to leave that sport and make sure that that experience of leaving is a positive one. to the best of your abilities, I think. So,
In fact,
yeah.
probably one more tagged on to that, but as you were talking, I suppose Paralympic movement's gone quite quickly in quite a short space of time as well, especially in terms of the competition and the level. Is this something potentially where it's catching up in other areas?
Yeah.
With the Olympic movement?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. That one of the reasons I'm interested in this project is we have seen such a dramatic change in parasport over the last decade. And so this is really, the athletes that I'm interviewing on this project, they're really the first generation of Paralympians, retiring Paralympians who were full-time athletes. Prior to that, people weren't full-time Paralympic athletes because you couldn't make a career out of being a full-time Paralympic athlete. So in that sense, this is a new situation for everyone involved. And yeah, we are sort of trying to catch up. I mean, it's great to see where Paralympic sport's gone, but we have to make sure that the services are keeping up with that change.